My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm 67 years old, and I spent my entire life working as a school librarian in a small town in Florida. After my husband passed away, I decided it was time for a fresh start, a smaller house closer to the sea. I called my daughter, hoping to ask for her help, hoping we might spend some time together like we used to, but her answer shook me to my core. She was too busy. She didn't even try to find a moment, so I did something she never expected. I disappeared from her life without a trace. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I was 67 years old when I finally admitted to myself that I could not live like that any longer. For nearly 4 decades, I had called that house on Willow Creek Lane my home. It had seen birthday parties and Christmas mornings, scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. It had seen the best and worst of me, the rise and slow unraveling of a life built with dreams that over time became quieter, simpler, worn like the fabric on my favorite armchair. I had been a school librarian in our small town in Florida for over 30 years, and after retiring, I thought I would settle into a life of quiet comfort. But comfort, I had learned, has little to do with furniture and everything to do with feeling seen, feeling valued, feeling needed. And somewhere along the line, those feelings had dried up, leaving me walking the empty halls of that house like a ghost. After my husband passed away, the house grew heavier around me. Every creak of the floorboards reminded me of a laugh that no longer filled the kitchen. Every unopened door led to a room that hadn't been touched in months, maybe years. Dust settled in the corners like unspoken goodbyes. It wasn't just loneliness that gnawed at me. It was the sense of being tethered to a past that no longer had a place in the present. I knew the decision had been coming for a while. It lingered in my mind every time I struggled up the stairs with a laundry basket, every time the roof leaked during a thunderstorm, every time I realized another appliance needed replacing, and I no longer had the energy to deal with it. It hovered in the quiet moments when I sat on the front porch with a cup of tea staring at the road where no familiar cars ever pulled into the driveway anymore. Still, it wasn't until a rainy Thursday morning that I finally made the choice. I was standing in the kitchen watching rainwater slip down the cracked window pane, the gray light making the whole room look tired. I held a cup of coffee between my hands, feeling its heat seep into my skin, and realized how little of that warmth reached deeper than the surface. I thought about the rest of my life stretched out ahead of me, years that could either be spent clinging to empty spaces or creating something new. That was the moment it became clear. I didn't want to die in that house. I didn't want to be found years later by neighbors who barely remembered my name. I didn't want to keep waiting for a knock on the door that would never come. I wanted the ocean. I wanted mornings filled with sea air instead of stale loneliness evenings lit by the sun dipping below the horizon rather than the dim flickering bulbs of a too quiet home. I wanted to build a new rhythm even if it was just for myself. I set my coffee down and pulled a yellow notepad from the drawer, the same one I used to make grocery lists and reminders. At the top, I wrote in firm, careful letters, "Moving plan." It didn't matter that I had no details yet, no realtor, no timeline. What mattered was that the decision had been made. Over the next few days, I began sorting through the house, one drawer, one closet at a time. I touched every object, letting memories flood me before deciding whether to keep it or let it go. Some things made the choice easy. The cracked teapot from my first year of marriage, the threadbare Afghan my grandmother had crocheted, the faded photographs from vacations long past. These would come with me. They were pieces of my story I wasn't willing to leave behind. Other things I released without ceremony, boxes of outdated paperwork sweaters that no longer fit dishes for dinner parties that would never happen again. I donated, sold, gave away what I could. Each empty shelf, Each cleared space made the house feel a little less like home, and a little more like what it truly was, now a place I was preparing to leave. The decision to move wasn't impulsive. It wasn't born out of anger or despair. It was a quiet, steady rebellion against disappearing into a life that had stopped being mine. It was a decision to choose myself after years of choosing everyone else first. The next step was finding where I wanted to go. I spent long evenings scrolling through listings online, searching for something small, manageable, close to the coast where I had always dreamed of living. I wasn't looking for grandeur. I wanted a cottage with worn wood floors and windows that opened to the sound of waves. I wanted a garden just big enough to grow tomatoes and herbs, a kitchen where I could bake bread on lazy Sunday mornings, a porch where I could read without interruption. When I found the listing, a modest one-bedroom house half a mile from the beach with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch, I knew it wasn't perfect. It needed work, but it was real. It was mine. I contacted a realtor the next day to begin the process of selling my old house. I didn't tell anyone yet, not Susan, not Jessica, not even my oldest friends from church. This time, I wanted to build something quietly without the weight of others' opinions, expectations, or indifference pressing against my choices. It felt strange at first, moving through these changes alone. Every other milestone in my life had been shared: graduations, weddings, births, retirements. But now the milestones were private, personal victories no one would cheer for except myself. And that, I realized, was enough. As the for sale sign went up in the front yard a few weeks later, I stood at the living room window, watching the realtor pound the stake into the ground. I thought I might feel sadness, maybe even regret. Instead, I felt a surprising kind of lightness, as if all the invisible burdens tied to that house had begun to lift one by one. I wasn't running away from my life. I was running toward it. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel trapped by memories or paralyzed by fear of the unknown. I felt free. After the for sale sign was firmly planted in the yard and the listing went live, I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. The soft ticking of the wall clock filled the silence as I turned the device over and over in my hands, rehearsing conversations in my mind that had not yet happened. I knew I needed help. I was still strong enough to sort and pack my belongings, but moving furniture, lifting boxes, coordinating the chaos of relocation, it was more than I could manage on my own. I thought immediately of my daughter, Melissa. It was natural, wasn't it? Mothers called their children for help. It wasn't supposed to feel like an imposition or a desperate plea. It was supposed to be understood, automatic, even woven into the fabric of family-like breathing. After everything I had given, after every year spent sewing costumes for school plays, staying up late to help with homework, cheering from the sidelines at endless soccer games, it didn't seem unreasonable to hope that she would be there for me now. I hesitated, feeling the familiar old ache I rarely let myself acknowledge. The distance between Melissa and me had been growing for years, not measured in miles, but in something heavier, harder to name. We spoke, of course. We exchanged texts on holidays and birthdays. She visited for the occasional lunch when her schedule allowed. But our conversations had become transactional, shallow exchanges of news and weather, never dipping below the surface into the real waters of our lives. Still, I dialed her number. The phone rang several times before she picked up. I could hear movement in the background voices, the clatter of dishes, and her voice when it came through the receiver was brisk, preoccupied. I told her about the move, about my decision to sell the house, about the little cottage by the beach. I tried to keep my voice light, casual, but even to my own ears it sounded thin, strained, with an emotion I couldn't quite hide. I asked if she could come help me with the move. There was a pause, so slight I might have missed it if I hadn't been holding my breath. She laughed a little, the way people do when they're uncomfortable. She said she was incredibly busy with work, deadlines, meetings, projects. She mentioned the kids' soccer tournaments, and her husband's new job, and the sheer impossibility of fitting anything else into her schedule right now. It wasn't that she didn't want to, she said it was just bad timing. I waited, hoping she might offer an alternative. Another weekend, a day off, an apology, but none came. She ended the conversation quickly, promising to call soon to check in. Her voice faded out with the distracted warmth of someone saying goodbye to a stranger they barely knew. When the call ended, I sat at the table staring at the blank screen of my phone. My hands felt cold. My chest felt hollow, like the last bit of air had been sucked out, and there wasn't enough strength left to draw another breath. I had not expected miracles. I had not expected grand gestures. But I had expected her to try to hear the need beneath my carefully chosen words, to understand that this wasn't about boxes or furniture. It was about being seen, about being valued enough to inconvenience herself for me the way I had done for her 1,000 times before, without a second thought. I tried to push the hurt away, telling myself she was busy, that her life was complicated, that young people these days lived at a different pace. But excuses are thin armor against the blade of realization, and the truth cut cleanly. I was no longer a priority. I was a task to be postponed, a burden to be avoided. I looked around the kitchen, the worn countertops, the scarred wooden chairs, the faded curtains that had once framed a life brimming with noise and laughter. I realized with a kind of aching clarity that I had clung to this place for far longer than I should have, believing it anchored me to the people I loved. But walls and photographs and carefully stored holiday decorations could not hold together what had already unraveled. I was alone in this transition, utterly unapologetically alone, and strangely, the sadness of that realization was quickly followed by something else, a flicker of resolve, a cooling, clarifying wind moving through the cluttered spaces of my mind. If Melissa couldn't be bothered to stand beside me as I built the next chapter of my life, then she had no claim to it. I didn't say the words out loud. I didn't shout or cry or rage. I simply stood up from the table, slipped my phone into my pocket, and returned to my packing. If I had to move my life on my own, then I would, and when I did, I would leave more behind than just furniture and old memories. I would leave behind the quiet, aching hope that my daughter would ever be someone she clearly could not be. I would move forward carrying only what was mine to carry. In the days that followed that conversation with Melissa, I moved through the house like a woman wading through fog. Every room, every object seemed to shimmer with a strange, unsettling clarity. Things that once brought me comfort now felt hollow, stripped of the emotions I had so carefully stitched into them over the years. I had thought the hardest part would be packing the belongings, choosing what to keep and what to leave behind. I hadn't anticipated that the real weight would come from the things I could not box up or donate, the memories, the expectations, the small, stubborn pieces of myself that had always believed family would come through when it mattered most. Melissa's refusal to help was not simply an inconvenience. It was not the casual, busy response of an overworked woman caught up in her own life. It was a mirror held up without mercy, reflecting back the truth I had avoided seeing for far too long. She didn't see me not the way I needed to be seen. I wasn't her safe place anymore. I wasn't the steady hand she reached for when life grew overwhelming. I was a responsibility. She resented a footnote in the grand narrative she was writing for herself. And the worst part was that I had let it happen. I had stood quietly by accepting smaller and smaller portions of her attention, convincing myself that scraps were better than nothing. I spent long evenings sitting in the old rocking chair by the living room window, staring out at the familiar curve of the road, watching neighbors come and go. Life pulsed steadily outside my walls, indifferent to the small heartbreak unfolding in the corners of my heart. I thought about the years I had spent building a life around Melissa's needs, organizing my days to fit into the margins she allowed me. Birthday parties, soccer games, recitals, graduations. I had been there for every milestone, camera in hand, heart wide open. I realized that my love had become a kind of currency, valuable only when it served her, invisible when it did not. The sadness that welled up inside me was deep and old, a sadness that reached back through generations of women who had given and given, believing that love must be earned, must be proven through endless sacrifice. I had believed it too. I had believed that if I just loved her enough, if I just stayed patient enough, if I just kept showing up, no matter how often I was sidelined, eventually she would see me again the way she once had. But children grow up. They outgrow more than their clothes and toys. They outgrow needs they once believed would never fade. And sometimes they outgrow the people who built their foundations without even a backward glance. I wasn't angry. I was simply tired. Tired of chasing a relationship that felt more like a negotiation. Tired of shrinking myself down into something easier for her to carry. Tired of measuring my worth by someone else's convenience. In that tiredness, I found a strange, fragile kind of freedom. If Melissa could choose herself without hesitation, then so could I. I began to reframe the narrative I had lived by for so long. Maybe it wasn't a failure to love that had brought us here. Maybe it was the refusal to recognize that love alone could not bridge the chasm that had formed between who we once were and who we had become. I packed slower after that realization. Not because of hesitation, but because every box I filled felt lighter. I wasn't just moving physical objects from one place to another. I was moving the weight of old obligations, of invisible contracts I had signed without realizing it. I made decisions with a new clarity. I kept only what I loved, what reflected who I was without her approval. I let go of things that tethered me to a version of my life that no longer existed. Family photo albums stayed, but the framed pictures of forced smiles and uncomfortable gatherings went into storage. Gifts given out of obligation rather than affection were donated without a second thought. Trinkets and souvenirs from vacations Melissa barely remembered were packed away for good. I wasn't erasing the past. I was editing it, choosing the parts that honored who I was, not just who I had been for someone else. Each day, the house grew emptier, but I grew fuller. Fuller of resolve, fuller of peace. Fuller of the quiet, stubborn belief that I deserved a life that didn't require me to beg for space in it. More than just a refusal, Melissa's dismissal had been a turning point. Not a door slammed in anger, but a door quietly closed with no intention of reopening. And for once, I didn't chase after it. I let it shut. I let the silence settle. I let the loneliness in just enough to remind me that it was survivable, that it was better than the slow suffocation of being half welcome in someone else's life. I folded the last of the linens into boxes and labeled them carefully. Living room, kitchen, bedroom, and somewhere deep inside me, in a place I had only just begun to recognize, I labeled something else. Mine. My life. My choice. My freedom. It was more than just a refusal. It was an invitation to finally set myself free. Once I accepted that I would be making this move alone, everything inside me settled into a quiet kind of focus. I moved through the days deliberately unseen, by most unnoticed, even by the few people who might have otherwise taken an interest. It suited me. I no longer needed an audience. I didn't need validation. I didn't even need help. I needed only a plan and the steady patience to carry it out. Every morning I rose early, long before the sun warmed the tired wood floors of the old house. I wrapped myself in my favorite shawl, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, notebook open before me. I made lists. Not frantic, overwhelming lists like the ones I had made in my younger years, but calm, methodical ones. One page for things to sell, another for things to donate, another for things that would make the journey with me to my little house near the sea. I boxed items in small increments, choosing to start with the rooms that hurt the least. The guest room that hadn't seen a guest in 5 years. The upstairs bathroom with its leaky faucet. The dusty den with its aging recliner no one sat in anymore. I worked steadily, careful not to overexert myself. Careful not to allow the sheer magnitude of the task to overwhelm the quiet determination I had so carefully built. Each packed box felt like a silent victory. Each cleared shelf a small reclaiming of space and self. The memories clung to some objects stubborn and sharp. An old Christmas ornament Melissa had made in elementary school. Her messy handwriting scrawled across the back in fading marker. A worn recipe card in my mother's script stained with decades of use. Frank's favorite coffee mug chipped at the rim, the handle still fitting perfectly in my hand. These things I allowed myself to linger over, to grieve for a moment, before making a decision. Some I packed with care, wrapping them in tissue paper like fragile treasures. Others I let go, whispering a soft goodbye that no one but the walls could hear. I made trips to the local donation center, driving back and forth with my small sedan packed to the brim. I smiled at the volunteers, exchanged pleasantries, and never once mentioned that I was dismantling the life I had built brick by brick, memory by memory. It felt good in a strange way to move quietly through the world unseen and uninterrupted. I had spent so many years living for others, adapting to their needs, contorting myself to fit into spaces that had grown smaller and smaller. Now, in the silence of this slow unmaking, I found a kind of sacredness. No one was watching. No one was judging. No one was telling me who I should be, or what I should keep, or where I should go. This was mine, all mine. The realtor handled the sale of the house with efficient professionalism. She listed it at a price that reflected its age and charm, and within days there were offers, good ones, families eager to fill the halls with new life, new stories. I felt a pang of sorrow when the papers were signed, but it was a clean kind of sorrow, the kind that acknowledged an ending without wishing to undo it. I made arrangements for the utilities to be shut off after my move. I forwarded my mail to a post office box in the new town. I paid off small, lingering bills and canceled services I would no longer need. With each completed task, I felt a little lighter, a little closer to the woman I was becoming. Melissa didn't call again. I didn't reach out either. There was nothing left to say. I knew that when she finally realized I was gone, she would be surprised. She would search for the familiar landmarks of our relationship, holidays, phone calls, the occasional Sunday lunch, and find them missing like roads erased from a map. Maybe she would feel hurt. Maybe she would feel abandoned. Or maybe she would simply shrug and move on untouched by the empty space I left behind. It didn't matter anymore. I wasn't moving out of anger. I was moving out of necessity. I was moving toward a life where I no longer had to measure my worth by how much I could endure. As the day of the move drew closer, I allowed myself one small indulgence. I walked the empty rooms of the house late at night, barefoot on the cool wooden floors, the moonlight pooling in soft silver puddles across the walls. I whispered my goodbyes to each space, the kitchen that had once smelled of fresh-baked bread, the staircase that had borne the weight of a younger woman's hurried footsteps, the front porch where I had rocked Melissa to sleep on warm summer nights. I didn't cry. There was no room left for tears, only a deep, abiding gratitude for what had been, and a quiet readiness for what would come next. By the time the moving truck arrived, I was ready. Everything that needed to be packed was packed. Everything that needed to be released was released. I locked the door one final time, slipping the key into an envelope for the new owners. I placed it gently on the counter alongside a single note that read simply, "Welcome home." And then I walked away without looking back. The preparations had been quiet, the goodbye even quieter, but the freedom waiting for me on the other side was vast and loud and wild, and it sang in my bones as I drove away toward the life I had chosen for myself without apology, without regret. The morning of my final departure arrived wrapped in a heavy, still silence, the kind of silence that feels thick against the skin as if the air itself knows something sacred is happening. I woke before dawn, long before the movers were scheduled to arrive, and sat at the edge of my bed for a long time, listening to the steady beat of my heart, feeling the weight of what I was about to leave behind settled deep in my bones. The house was almost unrecognizable now. Bare walls stared back at me, where once there had been framed photographs, cheerful calendars, colorful paintings collected over years of slow, deliberate living. The shelves stood empty, their surfaces clean, but somehow mournful, like mouths closed tightly against all the stories they had once held. Even the smell of the place was different, less cinnamon and lavender, more dust and distant memories. I moved slowly through the rooms, allowing myself the indulgence of one last walk through the life I had built here. In the kitchen, the light began to shift, spilling pale gold across the linoleum floor. I ran my fingers along the countertop, feeling every chip and scratch, each one a quiet testament to the thousands of meals prepared, the endless conversations shared over coffee cups and late-night snacks. In the living room, I traced the faint outline of the couch that once sat near the fireplace, the worn spot on the floor where Frank's favorite chair had been stationed for years. I closed my eyes, and for a fleeting moment, I could almost hear the murmur of his voice, the crackle of the fire, the sound of Melissa's laughter when she was still young enough to think everything we said was funny. The memories rose like mist around me, not to suffocate, but to honor. They belonged to this house now, just as the empty spaces did. I had carried them as far as I could. It was time to let them rest here, to let them weave themselves into the walls for the next family to discover in the quiet moments between their own milestones. I didn't cry. The grief I felt was too old, too settled to find its way out in tears. Instead, it lived in the small, reverent movements of my body, the way I straightened a crooked doorknob, the way I smoothed the edges of the envelope containing the keys, the way I placed my hand flat against the front door, as if offering a silent blessing. When the movers arrived, efficient and cheerful, I greeted them with a smile that felt almost natural. They worked quickly, loading the last few boxes into the truck, securing the furniture with practiced hands. I let them work, hovering only when absolutely necessary, unwilling to get in their way or slow their momentum. It was better this way, simple, clean, no drawn-out goodbyes, no staged moments of sentimentality to photograph and file away. Just movement action, a life dismantled and boxed up and carried forward by strangers who would forget my name as soon as they pulled away from the curb. I left the house empty except for one thing, a small potted plant I had kept alive through the worst seasons of my life. It sat on the front porch, its green leaves catching the morning light, a living testament to the fact that growth was always possible even in forgotten corners. I taped a note to the pot that said simply, "Please take care of me." It felt right, somehow, a quiet, final act of trust. The last thing I did before locking the door was stand in the center of the living room, turn slowly in a circle and breathe it all in. The echoes of life, the residue of laughter, the faint pulse of something sacred and spent. Goodbye. I thought not, with bitterness, not with regret, but with a weary kind of gratitude. I closed the door gently behind me, locking it with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. I placed the envelope with the keys inside the mailbox for the realtor and climbed into my car. The mover's truck pulled out first, rumbling down the street, disappearing into the morning fog. I sat for a moment longer, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, heart hammering a slow, steady rhythm of endings and beginnings. I didn't look back as I drove away. There was no need. Everything that had needed to be said, everything that had needed to be felt, had been folded quietly into that farewell without words. The past could keep its stories. The house could keep its memories. I was carrying only myself into whatever came next. The first few days after the move passed in a strange haze of quiet busyness. The new house, small and weathered by the coastal air, felt foreign beneath my hands as I unpacked boxes and arranged my modest belongings in unfamiliar spaces. The walls smelled faintly of salt and sun-warmed wood, and the wind carried the distant roar of the ocean even through closed windows. It was comforting in a way my old house had not been for years, even though it still felt more like a place I was visiting than a place I lived. At night, when the air grew cooler and the streets emptied out, I found myself sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the sound of the waves and the hollow loneliness inside my own chest. I knew this loneliness would come. I had expected it, even braced myself for it. What I had not anticipated was how vast it would feel, how different it would be from the loneliness I had known in my old house. There, it had been a loneliness of memory, of being surrounded by the echoes of what once was. Here, it was a loneliness of possibility, of blank spaces waiting to be filled. It should have felt liberating. In many ways it was, but it was also terrifying. I checked my phone often in those early days, more out of habit than hope. I imagined foolishly that perhaps Melissa would notice my absence sooner, that she would call, hear the hollow ring without answer, and feel a sliver of concern. That she would send a text, wondering where I had gone. That she would knock on the door of the house she remembered and feel the shock of finding it empty. But the phone remained silent. No missed calls, no messages, no apologies. The emptiness stretched between us. A vast, indifferent sea. I found myself wondering what she thought when she finally realized I had left, if she noticed at all. Perhaps she stood on the familiar porch staring at the for sale sign where our welcome mat used to be and felt nothing but mild irritation at the inconvenience. Perhaps she told herself that I would call when I was ready, that I had simply needed space, the way people like to say when they don't want to look too closely at the real fractures between them. The truth was, Melissa had likely moved on before I ever packed a single box. I was the one catching up. I stopped checking the phone after a while. There was a freedom in that too, though it tasted bitter at first. Instead, I focused on building a life in this small, quiet town where no one knew me, where no one looked at me with expectations I could no longer meet. I introduced myself to the neighbors, a retired couple who spent their mornings tending a bright, unruly garden. I wandered through the local farmers market, buying fresh peaches and homemade bread from people who smiled without asking personal questions. I joined a small book club at the library where no one knew my history, where I was just Evelyn, not someone's mother, not someone's regret. The emptiness on the other end of the phone line became something I carried with me, like a stone in my pocket. Solid, undeniable, but not unbearable. It was a reminder that I had survived the unraveling of my old life, a reminder that I was more than the roles I had once played. One evening, as the sun sank into the ocean in a blaze of crimson and gold, I sat on the porch and wrote Melissa's number on a slip of paper. I folded it carefully, placed it in a small tin box, and tucked it into the back of my closet. I didn't erase it from my life, but I no longer carried it in my pocket, hoping for it to ring. If she wanted to find me, she would have to choose too. She would have to walk through the emptiness she had helped create, unshielded by convenience or excuses. And if she didn't, if the silence remained, that too would be an answer, a hard one, a necessary one. In the meantime, I would fill the empty spaces in my new life with things that made my heart lighter instead of heavier. I planted lavender along the fence line. I painted the kitchen walls a bright, cheerful yellow. I learned the names of the seabirds that wheeled overhead in the mornings. I discovered in the quiet that emptiness was not the absence of life. It was the beginning of something new. The days gradually slipped into a new rhythm, one so different from my old life that at times it felt as though I had stepped into someone else's story. In the beginning, it was the little things that defined my new existence, the way the early morning light spilled across the wooden floorboards, the hum of boats on the water in the distance, the quiet that lingered in the air like a trusted companion rather than a looming shadow. I woke each morning without an alarm, rising with the sun stretching my arms toward the ceiling as the scent of salt drifted through the slightly open window. I brewed a cup of strong coffee, wrapped myself in a soft sweater, and padded barefoot onto the back porch. There, I watched the world wake up, the fishermen setting out in their boats, the gulls crying overhead, the pink blush of dawn creeping across the horizon. Without the constant press of obligations, my time became my own in a way it had not been for decades. I spent hours rearranging furniture, not because it needed to be done, but because it pleased me to create a space that reflected who I was now, rather than who I had been expected to be. I chose colors that made me happy: soft blues, warm creams, bursts of sunflower yellow. I filled the shelves with books I loved, not books chosen to impress anyone else. I hung paintings from local artists, small and imperfect and brimming with life. I walked to the beach nearly every afternoon, letting the sand squish between my toes, letting the ocean wind tangle my hair. Some days I brought a book. Other days I simply sat and watched the endless dance of the waves, the steady breathing of the earth itself. The sea, indifferent and eternal, became my church, my sanctuary, my reminder that change was not just possible, it was necessary. I made friends too, though it happened slowly, naturally. There was Margaret, who ran the town's small bakery and insisted I try every new pastry she concocted. There was James, who organized weekly movie nights at the local library and had an encyclopedic knowledge of old films. There was a group of women who met once a week at a little cafe to knit and gossip and trade recipes, and who welcomed me without question. Without probing into the chapters of my life I preferred to leave closed. I said yes to invitations without hesitation, a habit I had lost long ago, in a life spent waiting for approval or permission. I learned to bake scones that didn't collapse into leaden lumps. I took a painting class, discovering to my delight that I was truly terrible at it and that I didn't care. I laughed loudly without covering my mouth, danced clumsily at outdoor concerts, lingered over dinners with new friends, until the stars blinked awake overhead. The life I built was not grand, it was not polished, it was not something that would impress anyone looking in from the outside, but it was mine entirely, unapologetically mine. I found that I thought about Melissa less and less as the days passed. At first, the thought of her absence struck like a sharp, unexpected pain, a ghost limb aching where something used to be. But gradually the ache dulled, softened into something quieter. A sadness, yes, but not a wound anymore. Just a part of the landscape, like the weathered rocks along the shore, enduring, unmovable, but no longer central to the shape of my days. I no longer wondered if she would call, or if she even thought of me. I no longer imagined what I might say if she did. There was a kind of mercy in that letting go, a mercy I hadn't known I needed until it settled into my bones like a balm. One evening, sitting on my porch with a glass of wine and the fading light turning the sky a brilliant violet, I realized something simple and profound. I was happy not in the wild, dizzy way of youth, not in the exhausted relief of a duty fulfilled, but in the quiet, steady hum of a life lived on my own terms. I had begun again not because I had been forced to, not because someone else had finally given me permission, but because I had chosen to. Because somewhere deep inside, the woman who had packed up a lifetime in boxes and walked away from everything familiar, there had always been a small, stubborn ember waiting to catch fire. Now that fire burned low and steady, lighting my days, warming my nights. I didn't know what the future would hold. I didn't pretend to think loneliness would never touch me again, or that grief would not find its way back in some quiet hour. But I knew now that I could survive it. I could survive it and still laugh. I could survive it and still dance barefoot on the beach. I could survive it and still choose again and again to begin anew. By the time summer stretched itself fully across the coastline, wrapping the town in golden heat and the soft buzz of cicadas, I had settled into a life so different from what I had left behind that it sometimes startled me to remember how afraid I had been to begin again. The fear felt like a distant echo now, a ghost of an emotion that had no place in the small, vibrant world I had built with my own two hands. My days found a rhythm that felt as natural to me as breathing. I rose early each morning long before most of the town stirred. I liked those quiet hours best, when the world was still brushing sleep from its eyes, and everything smelled fresh and promising. I would brew my coffee black and strong and carry it out to the back porch where the ocean air was already warming under the rising sun. I watched the waves roll and break in the distance, their endless, tireless motion a comfort I never grew tired of. This world was mine in a way nothing had been for years, not claimed by obligation, not shared out of duty, not dimmed by the need to make myself smaller to fit into someone else's expectations. The tiny house with its creaky floors and windows that rattled in the wind embraced me like an old friend. It bore the marks of its age proudly, the peeling paint on the porch railings, the stubborn garden that refused to be tamed. I loved it all. I loved the chipped edges, the imperfections, the way it stood strong against the storms that blew in from the Gulf without asking permission or offering apology. I filled the room slowly, deliberately. Every item in my home now carried a story I had chosen to keep. The faded quilt my grandmother had sewn when I was a child lay folded neatly at the foot of my bed. The old wooden rocking chair where I spent my evenings reading creaked familiarly with each sway. I filled the kitchen with jars of spices I rarely used but loved to open just to breathe in their sharp, earthy scents. There was no grand plan for my days anymore. Some mornings, I would walk to the farmer's market, a basket slung over my arm, greeting the same vendors with easy smiles. Other days, I would drive out along the coastal road, windows down, music drifting lazily into the salt-tinged air, stopping whenever I found a beach or a viewpoint that called to me. Sometimes, I would sit for hours with a book in my lap, not reading, just listening to the murmur of the sea and the whisper of the wind through the tall grasses. I was not busy in the way I had once been. I was not filling my hours to drown out loneliness or prove my worth. I was simply living, breathing, being, and for the first time in what felt like forever, that was enough. The friendships I had formed deepened with time, not through obligation, but through shared moments, laughter, the quiet intimacy of people who chose each other day after day. There was a gentleness in these connections, an understanding that nothing was owed, that affection could exist without demands. We celebrated birthdays with mismatched candles stuck into homemade pies. We held potlucks where nobody worried about impressing anyone else. We watched sunsets together in companionable silence, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. I wrote letters longhand on heavy paper, not to send, but for myself. Letters to the girl I had been, to the woman I had become, to the life I had left behind. I tucked them into a drawer in my bedroom, a secret archive of all the ways I had broken and healed and built myself back up. I no longer looked for messages from Melissa. I no longer wondered if she missed me. I had come to understand that some absences are permanent, not because of anger or blame, but because people grow in different directions, sometimes so far apart that no bridge can span the distance. There was no hatred in my heart, only a quiet acceptance that love once given freely does not always guarantee a return. I chose to love her still, but from a distance that protected the fragile peace I had fought so hard to find. My world was not large, it was not glamorous, but it was mine, completely, unapologetically mine. It was the hum of crickets at dusk, the rough comfort of a well-worn porch swing, the salt-crusted breeze that carried my laughter out over the water. It was mornings wrapped in sunlight, and evenings wrapped in soft, easy darkness. It was the simple, staggering joy of waking up each day with nothing expected of me but to live as I chose. Standing barefoot in the grass one evening, watching the stars prick the sky one by one, I understood something so deeply it rooted itself inside me. I had not lost everything. I had found myself in the stillness, in the silence, in the wide open spaces of a life I had built not out of what others needed, but out of what I deserved. This was my world, and at last, it was enough.